The cameras had been rolling for less than 5 minutes when the first ripple of tension moved through the courtroom. It was the kind of air that carried the smell of something inevitable, a collision between law and ego, principle and ambition. On one side of the polished oak bench, Judge Edward Chen sat unmoving, his hands folded over a stack of briefs, his dark eyes scanning the room like a sentry who already knew the enemy's next move. On the other, Pam Bondi, the former Florida Attorney General, wore a smile so composed it could have been chiseled from porcelain. Her posture was textbook, shoulders squared, chin lifted, as though defiance itself could be an ornament. The hearing was being broadcast live, a rare occurrence for federal proceedings, and the networks knew they had struck oil. Every news anchor on the morning shift had cleared the decks for this. On MSNBC, muted screens flashed close-ups of Bondi adjusting her blazer. On Fox, the chyron beneath her read simply, "Live, Federal Court. Bondi faces Chen." But inside the room, the quiet was louder than any headline. The only sound was the occasional shuffle of papers and the faint hum of the overhead lights. Even the bailiff's breathing seemed measured, as if no one wanted to disturb the tension before the first blow landed. Chen leaned forward slightly, his gaze fixed, not on the lawyers, not on the spectators, but on Bondi herself. "Ms. Bondi," he began, his voice carrying the deliberate cadence of a man accustomed to being heard. "Before we proceed, I need clarity on one point." She tilted her head, the practiced smile never faltering. "Of course, Your Honor." He let the pause stretch, the silence itself becoming part of the question. "Do you understand," Chen said finally, "that the law is not an instrument of self-preservation?" A flicker, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A tightening at the corner of her mouth, a shift in her eyes. The cameras caught it. Twitter would later freeze that moment into 1,000 looping GIFs. "I've always acted within the law," she replied evenly. "That," Chen said, and here his voice sharpened like a blade, "is not the question I asked." Somewhere in the gallery, a chair creaked. The court reporter's fingers stuttered for half a beat before resuming their mechanical dance. Bondi's lawyers leaned forward, sensing the ground shift beneath them. The judge's words hung in the air, not as a procedural query, but as a challenge, one that reached beyond the day's docket into the heart of her career. On a split screen in millions of living rooms, anchors began murmuring to each other. "He's going in early," one said. "Chen's not wasting time." The gavel sat untouched beside him, but in that instant it didn't need to fall. The rebuke, though not yet the line that would burn its way into the day's headlines, had already drawn blood. The courtroom knew it, Bondi knew it, and somewhere, deep in the silent corridors of power, the people who once relied on her political armor were shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The stage was set. The storm had only just begun to break. The momentary tremor in Bondi's expression faded as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the unyielding facade of someone who had survived more than one political crossfire. She adjusted the cuff of her blazer with deliberate precision, a small gesture that doubled as a reminder, to herself, to the room, that she was still in control. But control was exactly what Judge Edward Chen had spent his career stripping from those who misused it. Chen's reputation was not built on theatrics. He was the antithesis of the viral moment judge, the kind who grandstands for cameras. In his decades on the bench, he had cultivated a methodical precision, slow questions, deliberate pauses, rulings so tightly reasoned they left little air for appeal. Yet here, live on national television, there was an unmistakable shift. This was no ordinary hearing. This was a collision of two public personas whose legacies had been forged in the fire of controversy. Outside these walls, the conflict had been brewing for years. Bondi, as Florida's Attorney General, had been both praised and condemned for her handling of high-profile cases. Supporters hailed her as a defender of conservative values. Critics pointed to her decision not to join multi-state fraud lawsuits against certain corporate giants, decisions that coincidentally aligned with campaign contributions. Cable news had dissected those decisions, but here, the dissection was surgical, and Chen was the surgeon. He began again, his voice even. "We are not here today to retry old cases, Miss Bondi. but we are here to determine whether the choices you made in office adhered to the principles you swore to uphold. Bondi clasped her hands on the table. Every decision I made was within the discretion afforded to my office under Florida law. Chen didn't flinch. Discretion is not immunity. Her counsel shifted beside her, leaning toward the microphone. Your Honor, with respect, we're here on a narrow procedural matter. No, Chen interrupted, the word landing with the weight of a verdict. We are here on a matter of public trust. That is never procedural. The gallery stirred. Rows of faces, activists, journalists, retired attorneys, leaned forward, some scribbling notes, others simply absorbing the rare sight of a federal judge cutting through the veneer of political formality. It was then that the cameras outside the courtroom fed live commentary into the bloodstream of the nation. On CNN, a legal analyst leaned toward the anchor. What Judge Chen is doing here is setting the frame. This isn't just about Bondi's actions. It's about whether public service can be transactional. Meanwhile, back in the room, the tension thickened. Chen's gaze never left Bondi. I've read your statements from the time, he said. You've spoken often about the duty to protect Floridians, yet in key moments protection seemed selective. Her reply came without hesitation. Prioritization is a reality of any prosecutorial office. We cannot chase every claim. The judge's fingers tapped once against the wood of his bench. True, but when priorities align neatly with the interests of donors, it raises questions. And questions, Ms. Bondi, left unanswered, become doubts. Doubts corrode trust. The line hung in the air, not the savage blow yet, but a calculated incision. Bondi inhaled slowly, perhaps considering whether silence was safer than rebuttal. She chose neither. I will not apologize for exercising lawful discretion in the interest of my constituents. And I, Chen said quietly, will not excuse decisions that undermine the very law you claim to serve. Somewhere in the back row, a reporter's pen broke its tip against the paper. The bailiff's eyes flicked toward the gallery, ready to enforce order if the stir became noise. Outside, the story was already running wild. Trending hashtags formed like summer storms. Commentators argued whether Chen was stepping outside judicial restraint or embodying it. For those in the room, though, the noise outside was irrelevant. Every eye remained fixed on the exchange, aware that the real battle, the moral one, was only beginning. The hearing resumed after a brief recess, but the pause had done nothing to cool the air. If anything, the tension had sharpened, distilled into something more dangerous. The return of the judge to the bench brought the soft scrape of his chair, the faint metallic click of his gavel stand, a rhythm that seemed to announce, without words, that the slow burn was over. Bondi sat poised, her hands resting lightly on the table. She wasn't speaking, but her silence was calculated, a choice to let her counsel take the lead, to keep her own voice in reserve for when it mattered most. It was a tactic she had used in press conferences for years. Let others absorb the early blows, then step in when the narrative could be reframed. Her attorney cleared his throat. Your Honor, the defense reiterates that the allegations of impropriety are speculative. The evidence presented here consists largely of political commentary, not substantive proof of misconduct. Judge Chen leaned back, his expression unreadable. Speculation is a matter of opinion, but patterns. His voice slowed, like a man drawing a scalpel across skin. Patterns are matters of record. The courtroom reporter's keys clacked with renewed urgency. He gestured toward the witness stand. Call Dr. Karen Ellsworth. A middle-aged woman in a navy suit stepped forward, swearing the oath with a steady voice. Her resume, already entered into the record, identified her as a former ethics officer for a National Prosecutors Association. She adjusted her glasses before speaking. In my review, Ellsworth began, I found that during Attorney General Bondi's tenure, several high-profile consumer fraud cases were not pursued, despite substantial evidence and the participation of other states' attorneys general. Bondi's counsel rose. Objection, Your Honor. This is commentary, not fact. Chen's gaze fixed on him. She will confine herself to the factual record. Ellsworth nodded. Factually, the cases in question were dropped or not joined. Records also show that in several of those instances, political committees associated with the defendants had made contributions to Attorney General Bondi's re-election campaign. A murmur rippled through the gallery. The bailiff's eyes darted toward the noise, but Chen raised a hand, letting it stand. Continue. Ellsworth flipped through her notes. I'm not here to ascribe motive, but as an ethics officer, I will say that when discretionary decisions consistently favor donors, it triggers legitimate questions about impartiality. Bondi's fingers tightened around her pen. The camera, unforgiving in its focus, caught the subtle shift, something the networks would replay endlessly, zooming in on the faint white of her knuckles. Chen's voice was calm but edged. Ms. Bondi, do you wish to respond to the witness's statement? She looked up, meeting his gaze with a faint, practiced smile. Only to say that every attorney general in this country receives donations from various entities. If accepting a contribution disqualifies one from making lawful decisions, the entire system would be paralyzed. Chen didn't blink. A system paralyzed by accountability is a very different problem from a system corroded by its absence. The gallery went still again. This was the duel in its purest form. Not a shouting match, but a battle of philosophies fought in plain language. Bondi's counsel interjected, trying to wrest control. Your Honor, the relevance of these political contributions is overstated. There's no direct evidence. There rarely is. Chen cut in, his voice low. But absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence, and in matters of public trust, perception is its own form of damage. It was subtle, but the remark shifted the balance in the room. The 10. Cyan now had a pulse, beating faster with each exchange. The spectators leaned forward, sensing they were no longer just watching a hearing, they were watching a reckoning. The next witness was called before the hum from the previous exchange could fade. This time it wasn't an academic or an ethics officer, it was a former insider. The room shifted as the bailiff announced the name, Daniel Harper, a senior investigator who had worked in the Consumer Protection Division under Bondi's administration. Harper was lean, with the kind of weathered face that seemed carved by long hours and longer battles. He swore the oath, then took his seat. His hands rested flat on the wooden armrests, but his right thumb tapped steadily, betraying a trace of nerves. The camera operators, sensing a moment, zoomed in close. Judge Chen inclined his head. Mr. Harper, you've reviewed the scope of today's proceedings. Yes, Your Honor. Then proceed. Harper cleared his throat. During my time in the Attorney General's office, I was assigned to several investigations involving large corporate entities accused of deceptive trade practices. In some cases, the evidence was overwhelming. Internal documents, whistleblower testimony, consumer complaints by the hundreds. Bondi's attorney was on his feet instantly. Objection. This is hearsay unless tied to admissible records. It will be tied, Harper said without looking at him. Chen motioned for him to continue. In 2014, Harper went on, we had a multi-state case involving a major financial services company. Florida initially joined the coalition. Our team was in deep. Document reviews, depositions scheduled, coordination with attorneys general from over 20 other states. Then, suddenly, the directive came down. Florida was withdrawing. The gallery stirred again, the sound like distant wind. Chen leaned forward. Who issued that directive? Harper's gaze shifted to Bondi. The Attorney General's office, specifically her chief of staff, who cited other priorities. Bondi's lawyer was quick. Your Honor, my C. Lyant had no obligation to join every case. No, Harper cut in, his voice hardening. But we had an obligation to protect Floridians from corporate abuse. That case went forward without us. The other states won a settlement in the hundreds of millions. Florida consumers got nothing. Bondi shifted in her seat. Her pen made a soft click as she pressed the top, once, then again. Chen's tone remained level. Mr. Harper, did you observe any external factors influencing that withdrawal? Yes, Harper said, without hesitation now. Weeks before the withdrawal, that same company made a significant contribution to a political committee supporting the Attorney General. The words landed with the weight of a dropped stone. In the back row, a woman whispered to her neighbor. The bailiff's gaze snapped toward her, warning silent but firm. Bondi's counsel leaned toward the bench. "Your Honor, we object to the implication." Chen's eyes narrowed. "Implications arise from facts, Counselor. If those facts trouble your client, the appropriate response is to address them." The air thickened. Even the court reporter seemed to hesitate for a fraction before her keys resumed their rhythm. Bondi finally spoke. "I will not be accused of selling my office. I made decisions based on legal merit and capacity, not campaign finance." Harper's jaw tightened. Capacity wasn't the issue. We were ready. We were more than ready. The moment hung suspended, both sides locked in the kind of silence that was louder than argument. Outside, cable networks were cutting between the live feed and panels of analysts dissecting every glance, every hesitation. Inside, it was the stillness before a storm breaks. Chen broke it. "The integrity of public office does not end where campaign law begins. If the people believe their trust can be purchased, then the law itself is on trial." The gavel didn't strike, but it didn't need to. The line was sharp enough to draw blood without force. And from the look on Bondi's face, it had. The room felt smaller now, as if the air itself had drawn inward, tightening around the bench. Cameras stayed locked on Chen and Bondi, their faces caught in the quiet war of expression between them. This was the midpoint in form, but in spirit it felt like a summit, two opposing forces meeting at the very edge of civility. Bondi's counsel tried to regain ground. "Your Honor, respectfully, we are drifting into insinuations that go far beyond the record before this court." Chen didn't look at him. "Counselor, the record is precisely where we are. The record, the facts, and the trust of the people your client swore to serve." The attorney opened his mouth, but Chen raised a hand, silencing him without effort. His gaze returned to Bondi. "Ms. Bondi, you've spoken of discretion as if it were a shield, but a shield is used to protect. You seem to have used it as a curtain." Bondi's chin lifted. "I reject that characterization outright." "You can reject it," Chen said, his voice quiet but carrying, "but you cannot erase the pattern that gave rise to it." A murmur rippled through the spectators, no louder than before, but different now, heavier. The tension had shifted from speculative to personal, and everyone in the room knew it. Bondi's voice was steady, but there was an edge now, a trace of heat under the words. "My record speaks for itself." Chen leaned forward, his hands clasped together on the bench, eyes locked to hers. "Your record speaks, yes, but what it says is this: when the law stood at a crossroads between the people and your ambitions, you chose yourself." The sentence struck like a thrown stone. No raised voice, no gavel slam, just the cold precision of words aimed exactly where they would hurt most. It was the line that would, within minutes, be clipped and replayed on every network and across every social platform, a soundbite distilled from years of decisions into a single, unflinching verdict. Bondi's jaw tightened. For the first time, she didn't immediately answer. The pause was brief, but in that briefness, the perception shifted. A flicker of calculation crossed her eyes, the kind of pause that analysts would later dissect. Was it strategy, or was it impact? Finally, she spoke. "If defending my principles is ambition, then yes, I chose myself, and I'd do it again." Chen's reply was almost immediate. "Principles are proven by sacrifice, not by the avoidance of it." The line was surgical. Around the room, the air seemed to crackle. Even the court reporter slowed, almost as if her hands wanted to keep pace with the gravity of the words. Outside, the news cycle exploded. Chyrons blared. "Judge Chen confronts Bondi. You chose yourself." Pundits on split screens scrambled to frame the moment, some calling it judicial overreach, others praising it as a rare act of moral clarity. Inside, the silence lingered. Bondi's counsel asked for a brief recess, clearly hoping to drain some of the heat from the moment. Chen granted it with a curt nod, his expression unchanged. As the attorneys shuffled papers and the witness stand stood empty, the gallery whispered in restrained bursts, careful to avoid the bailiff's glare. Bondi sat back, smoothing the fabric of her skirt with slow, deliberate strokes. each motion a physical act of composure. Chen, meanwhile, sat still as stone. The gavel rested beside him, untouched, but the blow had already been struck. It wasn't a legal ruling. Those would come later. This was something more immediate, more dangerous, the planting of a seed in the public mind, one that would grow long after the hearing ended. The recess bell rang, but everyone knew, when they returned, nothing about this hearing would be the same. When the court reconvened, the atmosphere was different. The tension hadn't eased. It had deigned like cooling steel. The spectators returned to their seats with the anticipation of an audience who knew the second act of a performance was about to take a darker turn. Bondi entered with her shoulders squared, chin tilted just a degree higher than before. If the "you chose yourself" line had stung, she wasn't showing it now. Her counsel whispered something as they sat. She nodded once, eyes forward, as though the morning's exchange was merely an opening skirmish. Judge Chen adjusted the stack of files before him, a subtle signal that the recess was over. "Ms. Bondi," he said, "you've had time to reflect. Do you wish to clarify your earlier statement?" She didn't hesitate. "Yes, Your Honor. I want to make it perfectly clear that my duty was, and always has been, to the people of Florida. Every decision I made as Attorney General was guided by law, precedent, and the resources available at the time." Chen tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Resources, let's examine that." Her counsel interjected. "Your Honor, this line of questioning—" "I'll allow myself," Chen cut in. "Ms. Bondi, your office cited resource limitations when declining to join multi-state actions against certain corporate actors, correct?" "Yes." "And yet," Chen continued, flipping a page from the docket, "records show that during that same period, your office committed significant resources to pursuing cases that, while legally valid, had minimal impact on the broader public." Bondi's expression tightened. "Every case has an impact, Your Honor. Some are preventative, others are reactive." Chen leaned forward. "Or some are politically convenient." A stir in the gallery. The bailiff's eyes scanned the room but found no need to act. The stillness was taut, the kind that made every word land heavier. Bondi spoke slowly now, measuring each syllable. "If you're implying that my office prioritized cases for political optics, I reject that outright." "I'm not implying," Chen replied evenly. "I'm asking whether you can explain why certain cases that involved powerful donors, were deprioritized while others, less urgent but more publicly visible, received attention." Her counsel shifted again, but Bondi raised a hand slightly, signaling him to stay seated. "Because, Your Honor, in some cases, the evidentiary threshold wasn't met. We had to make decisions on what we could win." Chen's eyes narrowed. "Justice is not a scoreboard. It is not about wins. It is about service. And sometimes, service means taking on the unwinnable fight." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "With respect, I don't believe the taxpayers would have wanted us to waste their money on cases that couldn't succeed." "Then perhaps," Chen said, his voice lowering to a weighty calm, "you misunderstand what taxpayers expect. They do not pay for certainty. They pay for courage." The room seemed to inhale as one. Bondi blinked once, then twice, as if recalibrating. For a moment, she looked as though she might fire back, but then her tone softened, almost imperceptibly. "I have always acted with courage, Your Honor." Chen didn't move. "Courage without impartiality is just ambition in armor." It was another strike, quieter than the midpoint blow, but one that would resonate in a different way. Not the viral soundbite, but the kind of line that dug into the memory and stayed there. Bondi's gaze didn't drop, but the stillness between them had shifted. She was no longer purely on the offensive. Now, each answer was a step through narrowing space, every word weighed against the risk of feeding his next question. From the corner of the gallery, a reporter scribbled furiously, the pen barely keeping up with the undercurrent of the exchange. Outside the building, the live feeds carried the moment to millions, pundits debating whether Chen's relentless approach was discipline or demolition. Inside there was no debate. The balance of the hearing had tipped. Bondi had come back. From recess ready to steer the narrative, but Chen had already locked the wheel. The gallery seemed to lean forward as if the air itself were tilting toward the bench. Chen's voice, even when calm, carried that restrained gravity that made people stop mid-breath. His questions had begun to peel back the protective layer of rhetoric Bondi had wrapped around herself. Each syllable was deliberate, like the measured knock of a craftsman testing the strength of wood before the final strike. "You were Florida's top law enforcement officer," he said slowly, his eyes fixed on her as if he were reading more from her posture than from her words. "And yet, there are contradictions. Would you care to address them?" Bondi crossed one leg over the other, the faintest flicker of irritation passing through her eyes before the smile returned. That same practiced smile, equal parts charm and deflection. "I've always acted in the best interest of the people I served," she said, her tone light but edged with something unyielding. "And the record speaks for itself." A murmur rose from the gallery, journalists scratching notes, one young activist muttering under their breath. Chen didn't raise his voice, but his next words cut deeper. "Indeed," he replied. "The record does speak. The question is, to whom?" That pause, heavy, expectant, was a drumbeat. Bondi's fingers tightened slightly around the edges of her notes, a gesture only those closest could see. For the first time, she didn't immediately reply. Chen let the silence linger, a deliberate vacuum into which every camera in the room zoomed. From the back row, an older civil rights attorney whispered to a colleague, "He's drawing her into the box. And she knows it." The stillness broke when Bondi finally spoke, her voice dipping just enough to convey composure or the effort to maintain it. "Your Honor," she began, "with respect, I believe my record shows consistent commitment to the law." Chen leaned forward, slightly, elbows resting on the bench, the subtle shift of a man moving from polite inquiry to pointed cross-examination. "Commitment to the law," he echoed, almost tasting the words. "Does that commitment extend to decisions made when political favor and public trust pull in opposite directions?" Bondi's jaw tensed. She reached for a document, sliding it forward like a shield. "My decisions were guided by legal merit, not politics," she said firmly. A reporter in the front row scribbled furiously, the scratch of pen against paper loud in the otherwise quiet room. The air seemed to pulse with the clash of two worldviews, one rooted in courtroom precedent, the other in the backroom calculus of power. Chen didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You're aware," he said, "that public perception shapes the legitimacy of the very laws you claim to protect. When the public sees inconsistency, even if lawful, what then? Is trust expendable?" The question hung there, raw and unblinking. Bondi opened her mouth, then hesitated. The pause just long enough for the cameras to catch it, just long enough for the audience to feel the shift. Somewhere in the gallery, a veteran journalist murmured to a colleague, "That's not a legal trap he's setting. That's moral indictment." For the first time, Bondi wasn't steering the exchange. Chen had taken the wheel, and the road ahead was narrowing. The gallery had gone silent, the way a crowd does when it senses something irreversible is about to happen. Bondi's hands were folded tightly on the table, knuckles pale. She had answered every question, some with ease, others with the precision of a politician sidestepping a landmine, but this time there was no sidestep left. Judge Edward Chen adjusted his glasses, his gaze never leaving hers. "Ms. Bondi," he began, his tone flat, but carrying the kind of weight that makes people sit-stay. "Rater, you've spoken at length about legal authority. You've spoken about statutes, precedents, and your interpretation of duty." Bondi nodded, ready to interject, but Chen continued before she could. "What you haven't spoken about," he said, "is the damage done when those duties are carried out without the trust of the people you serve." Her expression barely shifted, a flicker of irritation, quickly masked. Chen's voice sharpened, cutting through the air. "Because in this court, and in any courtroom worth the title, the law without trust is nothing more than power wearing a robe." Gasps rippled through the chamber. The line hung there, not shouted, not dramatized, just delivered with surgical precision. It was the kind of statement that didn't need to be repeated because it landed whole, clean, and devastating. Bondi blinked once, twice, as if recalibrating. She reached for a response, but Chen had already shifted his gaze back to the docket, signaling the exchange was over. The camera zoomed in, catching her silent inhale, a reaction that said more than words ever could. It was over. The line would be replayed, quoted, dissected, and Pam Bondi knew it. The courtroom slowly emptied, the echo of Chen's words still lingering in the vaulted ceiling, as if the very air refused to forget. Reporters gathered their notes with fevered energy, whispering about the moment that had shattered the polished veneer of a political career. Outside, cameras caught Bondi's retreating figure, composed but unmistakably changed. In newsrooms across the country, panels dissected the hearing's climax, some lauding Judge Chen's courage, others warning of judicial overreach. Social media ignited with hashtags, memes, and debate. Had law and trust. #Chen vs. Bondi. Did justice speak today? The savage line had become an instant symbol, a moral litmus test for an era starved of accountability. For many, the hearing wasn't just about one former attorney general. It was a reckoning for the system itself. How could the LA stand firm if those who wielded it for public service also bent it for private gain? The question echoed in classrooms, coffee shops, and dinner tables alike. Bondi's office issued a carefully crafted statement, reaffirming her commitment to the law while denying any wrongdoing. Yet beneath the polished words lay a fracture, one that reporters and opponents would relentlessly probe. Meanwhile, Judge Chen returned to chambers with the quiet dignity of a man who knew his duty transcended headlines. His gavel remained untouched, but its metaphorical weight had been felt nationwide. In the days that followed, legal scholars referenced the hearing as a case study in the balance between discretion and duty, ambition and accountability. Activists hailed the moment as a beacon of hope, a reminder that justice could still bite. The story closed not with a verdict, but with an enduring question. When law and trust collide, which will prevail? For now, the answer remained unsettled, but the savage line had carved a new path in the public conscience, one where accountability was no longer optional, but inevitable.